Hello everyone, and welcome to part 5 of my lecture/discussion series on Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Due to this series, you'll probably want to check out the ones that came before this and the ones that will come after this. If you're entirely new to the channel, you may be interested in checking out some of our other videos, and I would certainly encourage you to do so. I call this a lecture/discussion series because I'm intending it for it to be both. Although I have read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance probably a dozen or so times. And although I have prepared notes and material that I want to present, I certainly hope that it'll be an interactive experience with those who are watching live interacting in the chat, and then also after the fact, after this is streamed and posted, that if you would like to participate in the comments, I would certainly encourage you to do so. And I'll do my best to respond in a helpful way there as well. So whether you're tuning in now to listen to this or whether you're listening to it at some point in the future, thank you very much and welcome to the stream. So before I go into what I'm going to talk about today, I want to do a little bit of a backup into the previous series so that you can understand where today's is going to fit in. Just kind of give us a little bit of a roadmap here. So at the beginning of the book, Pirsig tells us, Pirsig the narrator, who's riding a motorcycle across the country with John and Sylvia Sutherland and his son Chris, he's telling us about this technological death force, is what he sometimes calls it, that John and Sylvia Sutherland seem to be running away from. This sense of menace and oppression and boredom and meaninglessness that seems to, for John and Sylvia Sutherland, that seems to inhere in technology. And for Robert Pirsig, for the author of the book, this is not the case at all. And he doesn't detect that death force at all. Instead, he finds technology, in his case, the repair of an old motorcycle, to be a meaningful and ennobling experience. And so that is the overall problem that Pirsig is trying to solve here. And if you'll remember in previous lectures, I've said, hey, I think that what Pirsig is saying here, this sort of what he detects as that technological death force, I don't know if in the 21st century we detect that death force so much in technology, but we do detect it in a whole host of other systems, and that's actually what we'll be talking about today. In large part, and a whole host of other systems and phenomena that exist in the modern world. And a few of the ones that I mentioned are, for example, governments. We're often quite skeptical of governments. We don't believe in their value. We don't believe in their ability to do their jobs. We don't believe in their ability to pursue justice very frequently. We have the same sort of skepticism often about large corporations. We often have the same sort of skepticism about our own jobs. We don't necessarily feel that our own jobs are meaningful. We will often have the same sort of skepticism about schools if you're a student, particularly if you're a high school student, but certainly I think college students can have the same kind of skepticism. In all these cases, there's some sort of, let's say, hierarchical system there that we have a deep sense of distrust towards, a deep sense of skepticism, a deep sense of cynicism. And all of that, I think, is roughly cognate with the technological death force that Pirsig is identifying. So when Pirsig is proposing solutions here, I don't think he's just talking about technology. I think he's talking about all the systems in which we find that sort of meaningless death force. All right, so, and Pirsig's approach to this problem, remember, is going to be to, instead of running away from the death force as John and Sylvia Sutherland do, instead, he's going to run directly towards it. He's going to investigate that death force. He's going to investigate technology. He's going to investigate the patterns of thought and patterns of behavior that create that technology, that sustain that technology. And in doing so, he's going to try to find a solution for us to that technological death force, a solution that does not involve destroying technology, that does not involve running away from technology, but instead that involves sort of healing or curing or integrating technology, I think, are good ways of thinking about what he's trying to do. And last time in part 4, we talked about classical and romantic modes, and we talked about how classical modes of thought, classical modes of understanding, which are certainly more associated with technology than romantic modes of understanding, I think. We talked about classical modes of understanding and how, in contrast to romantic modes, which look at surface appearance, classical modes of understanding try to sort of pry underneath the surface. They try to divide whatever it is you're looking at and examine that object not in terms of its surface appearance, but in terms of its underlying form and structure. Right, and we talked all about that last time. So the reason why I'm going over that again is because what I wanted to talk about today, which is in chapters 8 and 9 of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, is I wanted to talk about how to navigate that system. Okay. what those systems look like, what those classical systems look like, and how to navigate them. So to begin with, what I want to do is to read a quote. So, we talked last time also about using the analytic knife to sort the sand of awareness, right? There's the sand of awareness, there's the handful of sand that you take, which is the conscious world you're aware of, and then you divide it with the knife of analysis, which literally means to cut apart or to divide, etymologically speaking. You divide that with the knife of analysis and you create these systems. And so what he wants to point us to now is the fact that when we interact with the world around us, we're not primarily interacting, let's say, with that landscape of sand, and we're not primarily even interacting, certainly in the classic mode, we're not primarily interacting with that handful of sand of consciousness. Instead, what we're doing is we are interacting with systems of concepts. Let's see. So he talks about how, so let me give just a brief summary before we get to the quote itself. And welcome to all of you in the quote, to all of you in the chat, to Old Oakwood Studio, and anyone else who happens to be watching. So we notice when we use the classic mode of understanding, you look at an object, and what you actually do when you employ classical analysis is you divide it, right? So for instance, we talked about the example of buying a table and chair set from a furniture store, and when one of the chairs breaks, you don't necessarily throw away the chairs and the table, you just throw away the one broken chair. Or perhaps you even look at the chair and you say, well, it's really not the whole chair that's broken, it's just this one leg, and I can actually just replace that one leg, perhaps glue it back into place, and then everything will be fine again. And so what you're doing there in both of those cases is you're saying, okay, I'm terribly confused by the fact that this microphone goes out once and only once per stream. Knock on wood that it doesn't go out again. Okay, so I'm going to reread most of that quote because I'm not sure where it went out. And thank you for tipping me off, chat. So steel can be any shape if you want, if you are skilled enough, and any shape but the one you want if you are not. The shapes of the motorcycle are what you arrive at, what you give to the steel. Steel has no more shape than this old pile of dirt on the engine here. These shapes are all out of someone's mind. That's important to see. The steel? Hell, even the steel is out of someone's mind. There's no steel in nature. Anyone from the Bronze Age could have told you that. All nature has is a potential for steel. There's nothing else there. But what's potential? That's also in someone's mind. And so he points out, oh dear, minutes ago, Jay Decker, do you mind telling me what the last thing you heard was? I apologize terribly for that. I know that that's an inconvenience, not only for me, but for all of you. It still seems to me to be the preferable mode, although I might be able to be persuaded the other way to use my secondary mic, which is lower quality. In the meantime, I'll mention that this is sort of a restatement in many ways of what we talked about a couple lectures ago with ghosts, right? So we talked about how the law of gravity is much less real than we think it is, right? There's some sort of underlying, what I want to say is phenomena. I think, technically, philosophically, it ought to be noumena, but, for the sake of simplicity, I'll just call it the phenomena. All right, so thanks, Jay Decker, for that commentary. I think I'll just march straight forward and explain the ideas well enough that it won't matter either way. So when we talked about gravity, we noted, okay, so what is the law of gravity? It's actually not quite clear. There's something underneath that is causing the phenomena. Yeah, actually, that's causing the phenomena that we associate with the law of gravity, that we associate with gravitational force. However, even in, say, the past 50 years, or I guess I should say past 100 years since Einstein, our conception of gravity has changed, right? Our conception of gravity has changed over time from, the apple is falling to the ground versus all matter attracts each other. Now we believe that it's something more like a deformity in the space-time continuum. Right, and all of these three things, they're all trying to map the same phenomena in many respects, but they're mapping it in a very different way. So clearly there's something underneath. It's not like, gravity isn't real exactly, but the point is, what is gravity exactly? And we don't know because our conception of it keeps changing, because we keep eliciting new phenomena from whatever it is that's underlying all of this, that is the thing that we call gravity. So in the same way, like if you say like, well, a motorcycle just exists in your head, it's all out of your mind. You sort of sound a little crazy. You sound a little bit, it starts to sound a little bit insane. But when you think about something specific, like a motorcycle, what you can actually realize is that what the motorcycle mostly is it's a system of relationships between parts. It is mostly a mental phenomenon. It is mostly a concept. It's not primarily the underlying material substrate. It's not primarily the rubber or the plastic or the steel that's used to make the motorcycle. Instead, it's the relationships between those parts. It's a system. It's a relationship between all these concepts. And by the way, it's worth commenting. Here's how, I've mentioned that I think that what he's talking about here in general is not just the technological death force, but sort of the potential, the way that all kinds of systems, businesses, corporations, your job, school, your family, your relationships with friends, significant others, etc. All of these can sort of be inhabited by that same kind of death force that John and Sylvia are running from. And Pirsig actually, I think, agrees with me on that point, that to speak of certain government and establishment institutions as the system is to speak correctly, since these organizations are founded upon the same structural conceptual relationships as the motorcycle. Right, so what we have with the classic perspective is we have a bunch of parts, and all these parts are interrelated. So far, so good. And is there anything else I want to say about that? Yeah, so notice, right, for example, that this, is true for, for instance, governmental systems I'll take as an example, right? To compare the government of the United Kingdom to the government of the United States, the reason why we have some conception of what the United Kingdom government is partially because there's such a thing as the United States government, the governments of other countries that we can contrast it to, right? So, in the same way that in the handful of sand example, right, if you have black sands and red sands, then you can draw some kind of distinction between red and black sands. Of course, if everything is one uniform color, then you're going to have, you'll never perceive that color at all because there will be nothing to distinguish it to, right? Let's see. I don't think I'm being particularly clear here, so I think I'm going to move on to the next section, which is about logic. So, but the summary of that, to put it as clearly as possible, is that the classical understanding is one which creates systems, right? It's one which creates systems, and it's one which navigates systems. And these systems are composed of lots of individual pieces that all have relationships to each other. Okay, so how do we navigate these systems? And Pirsig is going to say basically that that logic is the way that we navigate those systematic hierarchies. It's the way that we navigate those structures, right? Actually, I'll mention parenthetically, right? So when we talked about classical and romantic, you'll notice that these systems, these hierarchies, these structures don't really exist in romantic experiences, right? At least not typically. They seem to be much more associated with these classic modes of thought, right? So for example, if you look at a painting and you're feeling, you're perceiving it as beautiful, you're not particularly thinking about why it is beautiful, right? Now afterwards you can think, oh, well, it was, particularly beautiful because it was, a painting from nature, and I like nature, I like waterfall paintings perhaps, right? Or if you're listening to music, when you're just kind of in the moment, kind of grooving with it, romantically sensing and perceiving the quality of that piece of music, you're not analyzing it all. You're not dividing it into parts and pieces. Instead, you're sort of feeling the continuity and flow of the whole experience as one sort of undifferentiated whole, right? And by the way, this is the same way that you experience chairs, right? So normally when you experience a chair, you don't see it as being composed of all these different parts, because that's not relevant to your experience. Instead, you perceive the chair as sort of just an undifferentiated continuum we call the chair. Now, if one piece of the chair, stops functioning in the way you want it to, if one piece of the chair breaks, then you start to think of it in terms of, oh, like there's a bunch of interrelated parts here, and I can replace the chair leg, and then the chair leg is fine. Whereas if the chair is wooden and it's burned to a crisp, then you're like, okay, well, the chair's just gone, right? There's no point to trying to rescue that. In the example that I gave last time with repairing a computer, in the same way, most of us, when we use our computers, we just think of it as sort of an undifferentiated whole. We think of it as an undifferentiated continuum of experience in many respects, right? You're not thinking about the graphics card. You're not thinking about the processor. You're not thinking about the fact that there's 1 or 2 or 3 sticks of RAM on your computer. Instead, you're just perceiving it all as one object, right? And it's only when, when you need to look at it classically, when you need to sort of get into the underlying form, that you start to divide it and see it as different components. So when we talk about logic as a way to navigate these systematic hierarchies, to navigate these systems, to navigate these classical structures of concepts, I want to talk a little bit about logic and rationality first, because Pirsig uses logic and rationality in a somewhat idiosyncratic way. And I don't think that this is actually a fault, because I think everybody uses logic and rationality in a somewhat idiosyncratic way. And most typically, that idiosyncratic way is those things are logical are the things that make sense to me. Those things which are rational are the things that make sense to me. And if it doesn't make sense to me, it's not logical or rational. And, obviously I'm in some respects mocking the people who say and do that, although in some respects I think it makes quite a bit of sense for reasons that I'll explain. Particularly if you have taken a class on some kind of formal logic, for instance, symbolic logic or computational logic, first order logic or something like that. If you've taken a class on some kind of formal logic, then I've noticed that it's even more common for people to sort of cling to their particular definition of logic and rationality, and to exclude all others. And I think there's partially good reasons for this. Logic and rationality in some sense are the platform on which we hold debates and discussions. And if you don't have some sort of unified platform, some sort of unified referee or umpire to decide how the argument is going, then things can get very confusing indeed. It can be very difficult to have discussions unless there's some kind of unified platform. And so I think that, people who, take one logic class, or they're computer programmers and they take a class in computational logic, or they read a book about logical fallacies or something like that, they tend to think that they have the one true definition of logic. And I think that that's probably incorrect. I think it's certainly a crude and not very epistemically humble way of approaching the situation. And by saying that, obviously, I don't mean to say that computational frameworks of computational logic, or symbolic logic, or modal logic, or first order logic, or whatever logic class it is that you happen to take. I'm not saying that those don't have merit. I think they do. Where I think they have merit and don't have merit is that you need to see them as tools in a toolbox. You need to see them as wrenches. And so Pirsig is going to use an 11 millimeter wrench here. And if that's different from the 12 millimeter wrench or the 13 millimeter wrench that you're accustomed to using, I don't think that in any way his use of an 11 millimeter wrench is a refutation of the value of the 12 or 13 millimeter wrench. I don't think that his idiosyncratic use of the terms logic and rationality is in any way a refutation or even a contradiction of other people's uses of the term rationality or logic. I know, for example, that other Joseph, this is one of his bugbears a little bit with Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, is that he doesn't like the way that Pirsig approaches logic and rationality. So again, I want to emphasize that, if you are one of those individuals, actually like myself or like other Joseph who have some formal training in a system of logic, just calm down. I'm using an 11 millimeter wrench here like Pirsig is, and that doesn't invalidate the 12 millimeter or the 13 millimeter logical wrench that you might be accustomed to. Okay, so here's his idiosyncratic definition of logic. It basically is the set of rules which govern the relationship between the parts of the structure, hierarchy, or system. Right. So if you have a structure, if you have a hierarchy, if you have a system, all these interrelated parts, then those parts all have to have some kind of relationship with each other. And logic, or rationality, as he uses it, is, and that's the system, that's the way that I think I'll broadly be using it as I go through this lecture series, unless I note otherwise. I'll try to be consistent in that respect. If you have all those parts, those individual moving pieces in this system or this hierarchy or this structure, then they need to have relationships. And that the rules for those relationships are logic or rationality. Even if you are bristling a little bit with your 12 or 13 millimeter logical wrench, I think there's a clear analog here to more formal systems of logic, like, for instance, the first order symbolic logic that I learned at the University of Utah when I was doing my undergrad. And when did I get a minor in philosophy? I did get a minor in philosophy eventually. So I confuse myself sometimes because I almost got enough credits for a major, but didn't. So I forget whether I almost got a major or whether I almost got a minor. I did get a minor. I didn't complete all the requirements for a major. Anyway, so let's say, Well, let's just take the logical statement, right? If there's smoke, there's fire. All right. So what we have here is we have sort of two pieces, right? We have two entities, two phenomena, two objects, two things, right? Two concepts. Really, because these concepts can span, across time and across space. A fire in one place is a fire, even if there's fires in other places too, right? It transcends time and space. It's conceptual in many respects, right? So we have this thing called fire. We have this thing called smoke, and there's a logical relationship between these two, which is if there is smoke, there has to be a fire, right? There must necessarily be a fire nearby, right? And so that what logic is, so structured logically, it would be if smoke, therefore fire, right? And you could write that out in symbolic logic. You could write that out in computational logic, or you could just say it in plain English, which is, if there's smoke, there's fire. So notice we have two things, smoke and fire, and there's a relationship defined between those two things, okay? So Pirsig is going to say we have a structure of concepts embodied in the English language or in whichever language, right? And between two of those concepts, smoke and fire, there is defined a relationship such that if there is smoke, there is fire. And these relationships and rules become quite interesting and important because because of their complexity, and because of the ways that they can be used to understand and alter phenomena in the world. For instance, to repair a motorcycle. To take the fire example, you'll notice that if there is smoke, there's fire, but that does not necessarily mean that if there's fire, there's smoke. Right? You could have a smokeless fire, for instance, if you use a gas cooking range, there's no smoke coming off of that, most likely, unless you're burning whatever it is that you're cooking. So the relationship doesn't work in inverse, and for instance, we could draw, we could create another structure by using the logic of physics and the logic of those rapidly oxidizing reactions that we call fire, right? So if you have heat and you have oxygen, and you have a fuel source, those are three necessary conditions for fire. So, and you can write that out in symbolic logic, right? Heat plus fuel plus oxygen, or, it'd be written out as heat and fuel and oxygen, therefore you have fire, right? And so that's just a simple example of how even in our own language, and even with something, is sort of elementary to our experience as fire, something that you've probably experienced in a variety of contexts, what's going on there is that there's a structure, and those logical relationships are illustrating for us. They're in some sense creating that structure, and in some sense revealing that structure, right? So for example, this also tells us how to put out fires, right? Because if you need heat, fuel, and oxygen to make a fire, well, one thing you can do is you could try to smother the fire, which is something that we sometimes do, right? You would throw a blanket over a fire, perhaps, in order to smother it, or you could spray water on it to lower the temperature of the fire. Or you could also deprive it of fuel, which is what happens when a fire burns down. The oxidizing reaction, that rapidly oxidizing reaction, can't continue because there's no fuel to continue to oxidize, right? And so what we have here is we have this system, right, of heat, fuel, oxygen, and fire, right? And there's relationships between them. And Pirsig is going to say that system of relationships, those rules governing those relationships, that is what logic is, that is what rationality is. And I hope that, even if this is an 11 millimeter wrench in contrast to your 12 or 13 millimeter wrench, it is still clearly a wrench because, if you've ever written out things in computational logic or in some kind of symbolic representation of logic, then, you're doing this. You're defining relationships between entities, and that's what enables you. That's what logical deduction is, and that's what logical induction is. It's correctly using the rules for relating different concepts, right? Okay, and there's also varying levels of precision here with logic. I mean, that's pretty clear, especially if you're more familiar with logic, then you'll definitely know that. Okay, so we've got something really interesting here. Remember, we're trying to figure out what the death force in this classical understanding is. We're trying to figure out what the death force in technology is. We're trying to figure out, so where is this death force in these systems, right? So what you have is you have systems, right? And these systems are a bunch of interrelated pieces, a bunch of interrelated concepts, and logic are the rules that relate all the pieces of the system, right? And so the question that we're going to be perpetually asking here is, okay, so where is the death force here, right? Where is the death force? And what Pirsig is ultimately going to say is it's the fact that we are considering these sort of classic structures by themselves, right? Remember, in the previous discussion, one of the things that we mentioned is that when you give a classical description of a motorcycle, the operator of the motorcycle is nowhere there. Excuse me. There is no I. There is no individual. There is no person. There's also no statement of values or anything like that, right? Science and technology are famously value-free. You can, use a nuclear, you can use nuclear power to, provide electricity for a city, or you could use it to, annihilate tens of thousands of people in that same city, right? That technology, that science, that knowledge, that system of concepts, right, that governs nuclear reactions is totally, or so we suppose, value-free, right? Okay, and so ultimately what Pirsig is going to say is when you properly understand where these systems come from, then you're going to be able to get rid of that death force. When you understand where these systems come from, and the fact that they're downstream of romantic processes, and that they're downstream, that they're not reality themselves, but sort of a model of reality, a representation of reality, a simulation or an analogy of reality. Reality sort of with a capital R, being whatever it is underlying everything, right? The sort of the true gravity, not the gravity that we measure and that we think we understand. Okay, I hope that's all reasonably clear. I believe there's a quote here. That I want to read. And then we'll talk about scientific method, I think. Oh. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, just trying to figure out, I apologize, I'm trying to figure out where I want to begin the quote. Okay, so the structure of concepts is formally called structure of concept systems. Right, and by the way, you'll see these systems, if you're paying attention, you'll see these classical systems everywhere, right? And I hope the last lecture kind of helped alert you to the ways in which you might be looking at things in sort of a classical or a romantic way. I just, before starting the stream, I spent some time preparing dinner. And in order to do that, I had to think in sort of a very classical way, right? I had to think about how to divide the ingredients and which ingredients should be used and which ingredients should not be used. And I had to think about all the ways that those ingredients would relate and go through different processes in order to eventually produce dinner. Of course, when I actually eat it, I'm probably not going to be thinking very much in that sort of classical way at all. I'm certainly not going to be thinking about my digestion. I'm not going to be thinking about the nutrients in it so much. Instead, I'm going to be appreciating the aesthetic sort of surface level experience of just eating and enjoying the food, right? Okay, so when you, let's see. Apologize, it's not totally clear to me how to proceed, and so I'm thinking about this a little bit. Okay, yeah, here's a good description of systems. I think I will read this and then and it will lead into the quote that I wanted to read. So he talks about how when he described a motorcycle, he created in some sense a box, a system, a structure, right? And he says this box motorcycle contains the box's components and functions. The box components contains the box's power assembly and running assembly and so on. There are many other kinds of structures produced by other operators, such as causes, which produce long chain structures of the form A causes B, which causes C, which causes D, and so on. A functional description of the motorcycle uses this structure. The operators exists, equals, and implies produce still other structures. These structures are normally interrelated in patterns and paths so complex and so enormous that no one person can understand more than a small part of them in his lifetime. And if you've ever, the more you go through life and the more you learn, the more you realize that there's just way too much to learn. right? You'll never be able to master more than a very small portion, comparatively speaking, of the classical understanding that we've built up over the decades and over the centuries. The overall name of these interrelated structures is a system. The motorcycle is a system, a real system. To speak of certain governmental and establishment institutions as the system is to speak correctly, since these organizations are founded upon the same structural conceptual relationships as a motorcycle. They are sustained by structural relationships even when they have lost all other meaning and purpose. People arrive at a factory and perform a totally meaningless task from 8 to 5 without question, because the structure demands that it be that way. There's no villain, no mean guy who wants them to live meaningless lives. It's just that the structure, the system, demands it, and no one is willing to take on the formidable task of changing the structure just because it is meaningless. Okay, and here's where he starts to talk about, systems as let's see, how would you say it? Systems as the loci, or the homes, or the locations of these of the technological death force. But to tear down a factory, or to revolt against a government, or to avoid repair of a motorcycle because it is a system, is to attack effects rather than causes. And as long as the attack is upon effects only, no change is possible. The true system, he says, the real system, is our present construction of systematic thought itself, rationality itself. And if a factory is torn down, but the rationality which produced it is left standing, then that rationality will simply produce another factory. If a revolution destroys systematic government, but the systematic patterns of thought that produce that government are left intact, then those patterns will repeat themselves in the succeeding government. There's so much talk about the system and so little understanding. And I think this is so crucial to understand, especially, if you are a reformer, which, to some degree all of us are, because all of us believe that the world could be, at least a little bit better than it is in some respect. Clearly we all disagree about what that better world looks like and how to get there, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in large ways. But everyone is a reformer to some extent. And what Pirsig is bringing out here is if you think the problem, let's put it this way. Let's suppose you buy a motorcycle. Well, let's suppose you buy a car, right? Let's use cars instead of motorcycles here. Okay? And when you buy that car, of course, that car runs. And let's suppose you just keep running that car and you never change the oil. And of course, if you never change the oil, if you don't know this about car maintenance, then if you don't change the oil, then eventually it gums up and it gets sludge and it heats up your engine and will just totally destroy your engine. And let's presume that it totals the car, and so you have to buy a new one. Now, what's interesting here is it's not the car precisely that's the problem. It's your way of thinking about the car. If you had a way of thinking about the car that included the idea that you need to maintain it in some basic ways, including, replacing the oil on a regular schedule, in accordance with the manufacturer's recommendations, et cetera, if you had that mindset, the car would not have a problem. It's not the car that's broken. In a very profound sense, it's not the car that's broken, right? It's your mindset about the car that's broken. And if you merely replace the car, you're like, oh, the engine has burned up. They sold me a bum car, right? And so you go buy the exact same car and treat it in the exact same way and don't replace the oil, you're going to run into the exact same problem, right? It's not fundamentally the car that's broken. It's your attitude and your behaviors towards the car that are wrong. And so if you continually see the problem as being outside of yourself, if you continually see the problem as being inside the car, and continually see yourself as being faultless and being as totally removed and distant from this problem and from any potential solutions to the problem, you're never going to be able to solve the problem, because the problem is not in the car. The problem is in the underlying modes of thought and behavior that govern your relationship to the car. Right. So these systems are nested inside systems, right? These systems are nested inside systems, and so that system of concepts that we call a car is nested inside a larger system, which is the way you treat that car. And if the problem is sort of existing in that higher level system of thought, it doesn't matter how many times you replace your car, you're still going to trash it. Right, and there might be reasons why you don't maintain the car, right? Maybe you don't know, in which case, there's a problem in your system of knowledge, right? Or perhaps you're the kind of person who doesn't have the time to do it yourself, or perhaps you think you don't have the money to do it yourself, which is, perhaps nominally true. Maybe you don't have money for a $20 oil change. But if you don't have money for a $20 oil change, let me tell you, you need to have money for a $20,000 car somewhere down the road. Or, maybe you'll buy a $2,000 beater. Right, but there is a sort of a higher level problem in sort of your system of concepts, right? And so this is very important, right? Because if there's part of the world that you consider to be part of that death force, right, whether it's your job or whether it's, I don't know, the economy or corporations or the government or the school or whatever, what you need to do is you need to understand not just, you need to understand the system of concepts that underlies it. Because if you as he says, right, if you don't like the government and then you get rid of the government, well, unless you have some sort of new system of concepts, you're going to end up with the exact same thing, right? It'll just be new people and a new name, but it will be the exact same thing, right? And so, for instance, you'll notice this, right? There's an old trope with relationships, obviously, that, if you have a bad relationship, then there's a good chance that the other person was the problem. But if you have like 10 bad relationships in a row, like, it's time to start thinking if you might be the problem, right? And so in that sort of case, it's time to sort of back up and say, okay, is my system of concepts, is that sort of hierarchy of interrelated things, is that serving me well, right? Is that actually the way that I should be thinking about things? And you have to reform that system of concepts, because that system of concepts is going to be, it's going to produce your behaviors, and it's going to produce the world of phenomena, right? This goes back to what we talked about in, I think, lecture 2 about attitudes. Right, and we talked about how attitudes are, not merely a sort of subjective opinion about whatever it is that you're dealing with, but also a stance and approach, and therefore also a pattern of thought and behavior, right? So if you can change, in order to change sort of the outer systems of the world, your job or something else, or if you don't like corporations, maybe you're one of those people. And, you're probably a left-wing individual if that's the case, or maybe you're deeply distrustful of government, in which case there's a decent chance that you tend to be more right-wing, at least in the United States. That's how these lines get typically drawn. If you think that there's a problem there, it's not enough to just replace the system. It's not enough to just tear it down and build a new one. Instead, what you really have to do is you're going to have to understand the underlying system of concepts and the underlying relationships and rules that allow you to that created that system in the first place. And presumably, if you can reform that underlying system of concepts, then you can reform the systems in the world around us. I'm sorry if I seem a little bit distant. It's just that I'm thinking of so many things right now that it's hard to think of precisely what to say, and there's quite a few interesting directions this could go, and even there's some things that I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I need to go back and think about that for a while to see if I think that's correct, or to see what I think that all means, right? And it's also true that for me, this part of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is actually the least interesting part of the book. To me, the most interesting part is when he goes on to talk about quality. It's true that talking about classical systems can itself be kind of boring and dull, just like classical understanding itself, right? And so in that light, I think I want to talk about what he says about the scientific method first, and then that will probably be all. And then next time we'll start talking about something that I find actually quite a bit more interesting, which is Phaedrus' time at the university and how he encountered this quality concept in the first place in the guise of scientific hypotheses. But in order to do that, we need to talk about the scientific method, right? So what he says is, in order to navigate these systems, you're going to use logic, you're going to use deductive All right, I'm frustrated enough that I'm going to go ahead and use my secondary mic. I hope the quality is not too much lower, but if my primary mic, if my good mic is going to drop out twice per stream, then I'm not going to mess around with that anymore. Let's go ahead and use the slightly lower quality mic that is going to be quite a bit more reliable. So I'll explain the inductive and deductive inferences once more, and I'll just assume that that was a pretty good point, right? So the example he gives of inductive and deductive inferences is that if a cycle goes over a bump and the engine misfires, and then goes over another bump and the engine misfires, and then goes over another bump and the engine misfires, and then goes over a long smooth stretch of road and there's no misfiring, and then it goes over a fourth bump and the engine misfires again, then you can logically conclude that the misfires in the engine are caused by the bumps, right? So you look at a particular thing that happens, and you deduce a sort of I guess I should say you induce, but you infer a general principle from those specific instances. Deductive inferences, broadly speaking, do the reverse. The example he gives is that the horn of a motorcycle is powered exclusively by the electricity from the battery. So if the battery is dead, the horn will not work, right? And you don't actually need to test that in order to know that. All you need to know is that the battery is dead, and you'll be able to know that the horn does not work, because you know that in general on these motorcycles, the horn does not work unless the battery is operating. It's powered exclusively by the battery. Okay, and so in order to operate, well, let's see. How am I going to say this? So he talks about the scientific method, and probably all of you are at least reasonably familiar with the scientific method, so I'm just going to run over it briefly, right? But the very first thing you need is, some kind of, you have a statement of the problem. You have a hypothesis about the cause of the problem. You have experiments that are designed to test each hypothesis, the predicted results of the experiments, observed results of the experiments, and then finally the conclusions from the result of these experiments. And you've probably all experienced this in some kind of middle school or high school science fair or something like that. So he brings out a couple of points that I think are quite interesting. One of them is that you need to be very careful in the statement of the problem, right? And you need to be careful to not say more about the problem than you actually precisely know. So he says, for example, solve problem, why doesn't cycle work, is actually a better and more scientific description than saying solve problem, what is wrong with the electrical system. Even though, why doesn't the cycle work sounds kind of like a stupid, ignorant question. That's actually kind of the way the scientific method operates, is by starting from a position of ignorance, right? If you assume that the problem is in the electrical system and it's not really, then, you're going to run into problems if it's not actually in the electrical system. And so excellence in this, in exercising the scientific method, involves not assuming any more than you are confident about, than you are truly confident about. He brings out one other really important and interesting point here that I thought was quite good. Experimentation, he says it's sometimes thought of by romantics as all of science itself, because it's the only part with much a visual surface. They see lots of test tubes and bizarre equipment and people running around making discoveries. They don't see the experiment as a part of a larger intellectual process, and so they often confuse experiments with demonstrations, which look the same. And he says, a man conducting a gee-whiz science show with $50,000 worth of Frankenstein equipment is not doing anything scientific if he knows beforehand what the results of his efforts are going to be. A motorcycle mechanic, on the other hand, who honks the horn to see if the battery works, is informally conducting a true scientific experiment. He is testing a hypothesis by putting a question to nature. The TV scientist who mutters sadly, the experiment is a failure, we have failed to achieve what we had hoped for, is suffering mainly from a bad scriptwriter. An experiment is never a failure solely because it fails to achieve predicted results. An experiment is a failure only when it fails to adequately test the hypothesis in question, when the data it produces don't prove anything one way or another. All right, so this is actually quite interesting because, I remember an experience I had when I was probably, I must have been 12 or 13 years old, but I went to a birthday party, and at the birthday party, there was this individual who was, there was an entertainer there, fundamentally, and he was a scientific entertainer, and he was giving one of these gee-whiz scientific demonstrations with his equipment, and he'll do various kinds of reactions and demonstrate interesting kinds of scientific principles. Right. And, it's all very impressive. And, when you're 12 or 13 years old and you've never seen that before, maybe it's, it's quite exciting to watch. But Pirsig makes a very interesting point here, which is that that's not actually real science. It's not real science if you know beforehand what the result of the experiment will be.
And so he says, an individual who honks the horn to test the battery, to test the electrical system of the motorcycle, he's more of a scientist than somebody who is than somebody performing one of these demonstrations, even though the one who's performing the demonstration is wearing a lab coat, and is explaining all about these chemical reactions and so on and so forth. The individual who goes out and has a hypothesis and experiments upon that hypothesis and derives conclusions about that system, that hierarchy of concepts from the experiment, that individual is truly more of a scientist than the individual giving the demonstration. And I think that's quite interesting and important to remember that although often when we talk about science, what we mean is sort of the body of knowledge that is associated with science and that has resulted from scientific inquiry. In another very important sense, that body of accumulated knowledge that we might call physics or biology or chemistry, that's not science at all. Instead, science is the process of continued experimentation, right? That process of continued testing of hypotheses. And I mean, I'm perfectly fine, obviously, with us calling those the sciences and so on and so forth. But it is very important to remember that, often people will say, well, you need to listen to the science. And, broadly speaking, I agree with them in the most general way possible, right? But in another very important respect, you can't ever listen to the science because the science is always shifting, because it always should be shifting, because it's always interested in pushing the boundaries of knowledge, right? And there's a tendency to see science not as that exploration, to see it not as pushing the boundaries of knowledge, but instead to see it as merely the accumulation of past explorations. And so in that sense, science can be very good for what you're, it can be very good for telling where you've been. It can be very good for seeing what you know so far. It can be very good for telling you what the accumulated knowledge of the past has been. But if you encounter some kind of new phenomena, then science as a body of knowledge can't help you because you're dealing with a new phenomena. Instead, what you need science as a method, science as a tool, science as a process of experimentation and exploration. And it's very important to remember that, I think, because it exposes one of the weaknesses of accumulated bodies of scientific knowledge, or any kind of accumulated knowledge. And it also tells you a thing about, you need to be able to use science not only to see where you've been, but also in order to figure out where to go next. Okay, well, let's see. Yeah, I'll read this final quote. An untrained observer will see only the physical labor of motorcycle maintenance and often get the idea that physical labor is mainly what the mechanic does. By far, the greatest part of his work is careful observation and precise thinking. They are concentrating on mental images, hierarchies, and not really looking at you or the physical motorcycle at all. They are using the experiment as part of a program to expand their hierarchy of knowledge of the faulty motorcycle and compare it to the correct hierarchy in their mind. They are looking at underlying form. Okay, well, that's a great quote to close off on. I apologize if today has not seemed to go quite as well to you as perhaps some of the other lecture/discussions have. Certainly to me, I don't feel like I've been on my peak today, and perhaps part of that is because I don't regard this as the most interesting part of the book. And I'm kind of anxious to move on to other things. It's also certainly possible that I may have gotten something wrong, that's the cause of part of the friction. Anyway, thank you very much for your patience, and I'll go ahead and close that off now. I'm very excited for the next time when we'll be talking about hypotheses and where they come from. And this is, of course, the launching place for Pirsig's investigation to quality. And so, at least in my view, things are about to get quite a bit more interesting. This sort of classical dry description of the motorcycle is far from the most exciting portion of the book, although it is important to understand these underlying concepts that will help to inform things that happen later in the book. So my apologies, frankly, if today was not perfectly up to your expectations. I'm not sure it was up to mine. And I look forward to taking another pass at it in the future as we move forward with the book. So once again, whether you're listening to this now or whether you're listening to it at some point after it's streamed and posted, thank you very much. I hope you're safe and well, and I will see you next time.